Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being with us. And I want to start out by saying I had the great opportunity of interviewing for a radio show our speaker tonight, Dr. Kimberly Hamlin, several weeks ago. And if you are like me, I wondered, who is this person called Helen Hamilton Gardner? And I came away from our half an hour interview adoring her and adoring our speaker tonight. So I think you're really going to enjoy the story that Dr. Hamlin has to tell us. Here we are in Newport. We cannot wait to open the houses, and I'm sure that many of you can't wait to visit. Our plan is just to keep you in the loop to open the Breakers and the Elms as soon as we get permission from the governor. I really want people to know that we have done everything possible to make both houses as safe and as healthy as we could possibly make them. So please pass that word around and pray that we can open the doors soon. I also want to make sure that you are aware that next Thursday at 5:30, we are going to be having a preview party of our newest exhibition. It is Becoming Vanderbilt, which features 4 Vanderbilt women, Alice and Gertrude Vanderbilt from the Breakers, Alva and Consuelo Vanderbilt from the Marble House. Our exhibition curator, Ashley Householder, is going to take us on a walking tour of the exhibition, telling us stories about all 4 women and showing us objects about their lives. We have collected things from around the world, from Vanderbilt family members, and we're very, very excited about this exhibition, and I hope you can come and visit it when we are able to open up Rosecliff. If you are interested in being part of that lecture, please RSVP to program RSVP at newportmansions.org. I'll repeat that, program RSVP at newportmansions.org, and then you will get a notice as to how to get into the Zoom exhibition next week at 5:30. I also hope that you're looking at our website, because under Leslie Jones, who is the director of museum affairs, we have now got 6 houses online for virtual tours. Eventually we'll have all of them online, but it's a phenomenal way to get to know our houses and every object in our house better. And every Friday, if you're looking for things to do with your children, there is Creativity Corner, lots of history projects for your kids. You can go to Instagram or our Facebook account and have a lot of fun with them. If this is the first time that you have been on a Zoom lecture, please know that you are on mute right now. At the end of the lecture, you will be able to ask questions of Dr. Hamlin by pushing the button that has more, going to chat, writing in your question, and sending it to Leslie Jones. Leslie then will repeat the question, and Dr. Hamlin will then answer the question. Now, Dr. Hamlin, she is a professor at Miami University in Ohio. She is an author and a historian and a writer. She has concentrated much of her work on women's history and gender history, cultural history, and the history of science. She has a BA from Georgetown University and a master's and a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. She has written many articles, given many lectures, and written many books. And she is a phenomenal speaker. She is coming to us live from her home in Cincinnati, and we are so lucky to have her. Thank you so much for being with us tonight, Dr. Hamlin, and I now turn it over to you.
Great. Trudy, thank you so much. And thanks to Jay and Leslie and everyone at the Preservation Society of Newport County for having me, and especially Liz for first inviting me and making all these arrangements. At first, I was going to come in person in June, and now we are here via Zoom, which in some ways is fun in new ways. It's great to see so many people and to have people from all over be able to join us. So I am excited for your questions at the end, And I'm excited to share with you some stories from my research from my new book, Free Thinker, Sex, Suffrage, and the Extraordinary Life of Helen Hamilton Gardner, and to tell you a little bit more about Helen Hamilton Gardner and why I think she's so fascinating and why I hope others will be eager to learn more about her. So I have some images to show. So I'm going to pause for 1 second and share my screen so that you can see the images that, that we'll look at together tonight. That was not the right one. Let me try one more time. For some reason, it won't let me go. There we go, to the beginning. Great. Now we are together at the beginning. So thanks again for having me and for your patience while I shared my screen. I look forward to your questions, so please make notes as we go. I'm used to a more interactive lecture when I do these in person, so I really am excited to discuss this with you together at the end. So you may be wondering, is this Helen Hamilton Gardner right here on the cover? So the first thing I wanted to say is no, that is not Helen Hamilton Gardner on the cover. That's a question people often ask. And the cover is inspired by suffragist art. So you'll see the image on the left is the image that the Ohio Women's Suffrage Organization made for their group. And you can see the inspiration for the cover. And in some ways it does sort of look like Helen Hamilton Gardner, who I often refer to as HHG, sort of in the great tradition of RBG. So we can call her HHG tonight for short. And that's a picture of HHG on the right from 1913, just as she's settling into her life in Washington, D.C. as the suffragist lead negotiator. So I know Helen Hamilton Gardner is an unfamiliar name. So I wanted to say a little bit up front about who she was, why she's so fascinating, before we delve a little deeper. Who was Helen Hamilton Gardner? Well, Helen Hamilton Gardner was the fallen woman, meaning she had sex before marriage. A big scandal. She was the fallen woman who changed her name. Helen Hamilton Gardner was not her birth name. Alice Chenoweth was. She changed her name, reinvented herself, and became the suffragist most powerful, prominent, effective negotiator in Washington, D.C. She got the 19th Amendment through Congress, and when she died in 1925, she was the highest ranking woman in federal government and a national symbol of women being citizens. So hers is a really remarkable story. If you can imagine in 1876, when she became a fallen woman, there was no options. There was no second chance. She had no role models of the sort of life she wanted to live. So she invented it herself. She moved to New York City, changed her name, and became Helen Hamilton Gardner. And remarkably, she managed to keep her scandal a secret her whole entire life. So I feel a little bit conflicted outing her and telling you all about it tonight. But I think, you know, from the great beyond, she would be happy about this because it highlights what has changed over the 100 years and what has not. So I'm also going to share some of the key themes from my research and from my book tonight. And one of those key themes is the importance of sex and sexual autonomy in motivating the suffrage movement. This is not something that we often talk about, but you can really see it as a link when we look through the lens and the eyes of Helen Hamilton Gardner. The second theme I'm going to highlight, especially towards the end, when we get to the part about how the 19th Amendment got through Congress, is the vital role of race, and more to the point, racism, in the suffrage movement and in the United States more broadly. And then our third theme for the evening that we'll end on is the theme of memory. Whose stories do we tell? Whose names do we remember? Whose names do we put in our textbooks, on our buildings, on our streets, and why does it matter? And then I'll look forward to your questions. So I first encountered Helen Hamilton Gardner when I was working on my dissertation, which became my first book, at the University of Texas at Austin. I was looking through old editions of this magazine called Popular Science Monthly because I wanted to see how people used science to talk about what it meant to be male and female. In particular, I was wondering if any 19th century women drew on the new science of evolution to make arguments for equality. I wondered this because I had been developing this class at UT called The Rhetoric of Feminism, where, like the overachieving graduate student I came up with a course packet like this big for my class, who I'm sure is still like cranky about it to this day. And it contained every primary source I could find from 1690 to the present where people were arguing about women's rights in the US context. Why should women go to school? Why shouldn't women go to school? And what struck me was everyone was always talking about Eve. Women can't go to school, Eve. Women can't be equal in marriage. Eve ate of the apple. She was made from the rib. So I began to wonder what happens when evolutionary science enters the conversation. Did this give women a new way to make arguments? So as I'm looking through Popular Science Monthly, kind of blindly on this quest, I come across this woman that I'd never heard of named Helen Hamilton Gardner. In fact, hardly anyone had ever heard of Helen Hamilton Gardner, but this did not stop her from writing one of the most popular magazines. And she wrote against this guy, William Hammond. Now, William Hammond was one of the most prominent scientists of the 19th century. He had been Surgeon General for the Union during the Civil War. And during those years and the years immediately following the war, he became fascinated with the human brain, and especially with emotional and mental challenges that plagued soldiers afterwards. Then he develops this specialty, and what he became fascinated with was the differences between male and female brains. Now, this is a recurring trope. I just had a letter to the editor in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago about another headline that says, aha, we found again how women's brains are different from men's. And then I sort of roll my eyes and say, here we go again, because this is what William Hammond was claiming he had done in the 1870s and 1880s. Now, Hammond claimed that he had found 19 distinct ways that women's brains were different from and inferior to men's. He said women's brains, on average, weigh less, they have less distinct convolutions, and thinner gray matter, and that was really what explained why women couldn't go to college or have professions, and especially why women shouldn't study science and hard subjects like that. So now this little known woman named Helen Hamilton Gardner picks up her pen and writes in opposition to William Hammond. And they engage in this back and forth in Popular Science Monthly. So the bottom image is the text of her beginning letter. And the top quote is from one of her most famous speeches, which she gives the next year. So I just want to read to give you a little sense of her voice and how funny and witty she is. The quote from this speech she ends up giving called Sex and Brain. And it also sort of shows that theme from Eve to Evolution, which was the title of my first book. So Gardner says, when religious influence and dogma began to lose their terrors, meaning when people stopped believing in the Garden of Eden story, legal enactments were slowly modified in women's favor, and hell went out of fashion. Then, conservatism, ignorance, and egotism, in dismay and terror, took counsel together and called in medical science, still in its infancy, to aid in staying the march of progress. And indeed it did. The key women's rights debate of the 1870s and 1880s that Gardner is weighing in on here was whether or not women could go to college, whether their bodies and their brains could withstand it. So she knew that the tendrils, the deeper meanings of this Hammond argument went far beyond some sort of esoteric question about the makeup of the human brain and reached into every element of life and women's aspirations. So she decides she's going to set the record straight. And indeed she does. One review says she bests the lion in his own den with her more rigorous, more accurate, more scientific research about human brains. So that's how I first encountered her. And that's when I started wondering, gosh, who is this woman and what made her so bold? What made her think that she, as a non-trained scientist, could take on one of the top male scientists in the country. So I began, but that's not what made me think that I needed to write her biography. I wrote a chapter about her in my first book, and then I sort of kept her in the back of my mind. And when I would go on research trips and archival trips, I would check and I would look for more Helen Hamilton sources, Helen Hamilton Gardner sources. And now I'm going to show you the letter when I knew I had to write her biography. So this letter, I was kind of doing like a hunt and peck mission at the Library of Congress in this sculptor named Adelaide Johnson. And we'll come back to her at the end too. Adelaide Johnson was the sculptor of Suffrage. And her description of her collections at the Library of Congress mentions Helen Hamilton Gardner's name, but it doesn't say where or why. So I'm just looking for like hours on end, thinking to myself, I'm looking for a needle in a haystack. Why am I doing this? And then I come across this typewritten letter that's written in code to little Phil from little one, but I recognize that handwriting in the top left corner. Now, if we were in person, I would ask for a volunteer to try to decipher what the handwriting says. Now, since I can't see your faces or if you're raising your hands, I will read it for you. What it says, and what I recognized immediately as HHG's handwriting, what it says is, best destroy this letter, underline, underline. Now, when you're a historian in the archive and you find a letter that says, best destroy this letter, you think, aha, there's something good. And indeed there was. What is inside this 3-page typewritten, another bonus for a historian, I could read it. What is inside this 3-page typewritten letter from 1901 is Helen Hamilton Gardner in code telling her best friend the secrets of her life, her secret 25-year-long affair with a man that was not her husband, and who she found out when he died in 1901 had a secret wife for the whole entire 25 years they were together, and that he harbored not only a wife, but a secret family, and that she found a letter to his daughter in his deathbed pocket. So she's revealing all of these life secrets. Now, this is a rare find in a letter. So then I knew, I have to tell this story. This woman is fascinating. I need to learn more. Who was Helen Hamilton Gardner? As I dug around, I found out she was born Alice Chenoweth in 1853 to a prominent Virginia family, a first family of Virginia. Her father was a Methodist minister and a slave owner. He had inherited the family's slaves, but as a Methodist minister, he was very conflicted about this. So when Alice was 1, he manumitted the people he held in bondage and moved the whole family to Indiana. So that's where Alice Chenoweth, who becomes HHG, spends most of her formative years, was in Indiana. All the while knowing she's part of this, renowned first family of Virginia. And an even more unusual turn of events, her father, at the personal request of Abraham Lincoln, ends up serving as a Union scout because her father had been a circuit riding minister, riding his horse all through the backwoods and valleys of Virginia and what became West Virginia. And the Union troops did not know these routes. So Lincoln called on her father to guide the troops, and all 3 of her brothers ended up fighting for the Union. This eventually kind of destroys Alice's family, leaves them impoverished. They move several times. And Alice Chenoweth, the youngest, after watching her mother, who's a widow, try to deal with the various probate laws, which basically leave nothing for women, and watching her 2 older sisters bear and bury many babies and then themselves die in childbirth, young Alice Chenoweth says, you know what, marriage and motherhood is not for me. So she takes what basically is the only acceptable career path for middle-class white women in the 1870s, and she decides to become a teacher. So she moves to Cincinnati. She attends Cincinnati Normal School, which is what teacher training schools were called. And then she gets a job in Sandusky, Ohio, a few hours north along the Lake Erie. It's a beautiful town. And she soon becomes the best, most celebrated teacher in Sandusky, and she becomes promoted to school principal. Now she is proud for her whole life because she is the youngest school principal in Ohio history, and she always includes that in her biographies. So here she is, 23 years old, 5'1", not quite 100 pounds, very beautiful, very charming, the youngest principal in Ohio. Maybe you can see where this story is going. Soon, her neighbors in Sandusky begin to whisper because the Ohio Commissioner of Common Schools or Public Schools, a man named Charles Smart, is making a lot of visits to Sandusky, Ohio. So people begin to wonder, why is this statewide officer constantly in Sandusky? We're not the biggest town, we're not the capital, we don't have the most schools. Eventually it emerges in large part because Alice Chenoweth has the misfortune to be a boarder in the same house as the guy who's the brother of the newspaper owner and editor. So news travels fast in her boarding house, from her boarding house to the newspaper. Soon it emerges that the Ohio Commissioner of Common Schools is coming to Sandusky to visit the young school principal. His name is Charles Smart. He's in his late 30s. He's also a married father of 2. So this becomes big news across the whole entire state of Ohio. Eventually, and this is throughout the spring and summer of 1876. They even begin to print Helen Hamilton Gardner, her name, which at the time was Chenoweth. So I tried to blow up this little teeny story so you could see and highlight. Miss Chenoweth is her name. Papers across the state print her name. She is run out of town. She's forced to resign her job in disgrace, and she is now a fallen woman. This is the signature turning point event in her life. This is when she begins to question and think deep thoughts about what she calls the sexual double standard. Why is it that men are held to such different standards when it comes to sex? Why is it, she wonders, that a woman's life is, the biggest decision is whether or not she is a virgin, whether or not she has had sex before marriage. So, and I want to give you one quote. This is from the preface to her first novel, Is This Your Son, My Lord? And she says, "A man is valued of men for many things, least of which is his chastity. A woman is valued of men for few things, chief of which is her chastity. This double code can be by no sane or reasonable person be claimed as woman-made." So this becomes kind of her through line, her mission statement in life, to understand this sexual double standard. Now, as a historian, this scandal and her first name poses some challenges. So I want to take a minute in I don't know why those blue lines are on the screen. I'm not touching my screen. I don't know if maybe one of the other administrators are, but if so, maybe they could go away. Anyway, so I'm going to take a pause in my story of who is HHG for a second to tell you about some of the research challenges that are posed by a fallen woman who changes her name and also goes missing in the historic record. So after this scandal in 1876, Helen Hamilton Gardner disappears in the record for 8 years. So I'm going to show you some slides now of some of the ways in which I tried to trace her and how I could learn about her. And this honestly was so fun. People sometimes ask about the research, what it was like, and I will say, I had the best time doing the research for this book. It was a million times more fun than my first book, which is a more traditional academic intellectual history. For this biography of Gardner, I got to be part Magnum PI and part historian. And I followed her around and I went every place she ever lived, and it was a blast. The first place I went was the Chenoweth family reunion in West Virginia. I wanted to understand what it meant for her to be a part of this renowned, this sort of famous family that has many, famous ancestors, a really established lore throughout America. So my first stop was the Chenoweth family reunion, where I was welcomed in and I met a lot of great people, and that was so fun. I also learned a lot about Helen Hamilton Gardner by studying the Civil War service records of her brothers and the man who later becomes her husband in 1902, who was also a Civil War hero. So I'm showing you here what it looks like when you request the Civil War records of people at the National Archives and Records Administration in DC. You get a big stack of this teeny tissue paper, all folded up in a little bundle and tied with like this inscrutable knot that you can't barely untie by yourself, and you feel very self-conscious that you're going to rip it, while the eyes of the all-knowing, archivists who preserve these papers for 150 years look down on you. So I determined a lot of fascinating things about Gardner, her life, through the Civil War records of her brothers and the man who becomes her husband. I also went to the town where she lived in Greencastle, Indiana. The picture on the left is the probate records for Putnam County, Indiana, where she spent her youth and where her father died. And there I had a very fun and interesting time because I made my appointment to go look at these probate records, and they told me they're stored in the silver boxes at the very tippy top of the 16-foot room, but that no one is allowed to climb the ladder. So I don't need to tell you that I climbed that ladder. I did have to make a call to our university council, have a letter sent, but I climbed the ladder and I got the metal files from the 1880s and 1870s. So I could learn more about Gardner's family and what her life was like in Putnam County. And the picture on the left is the building that she lived in when she moved to New York City, when she reinvented herself, which is where we're going to go to next. And this was fun too, because I didn't have a name. There's many apartments in this building. I didn't know who to write an introductory letter to. So I went and I got a latte at the coffee shop on the corner, and then I kind of cased the joint from like 8:45 to 9 a.m. on a Tuesday, waiting for someone to come out, which is when I very much felt my like white lady privilege, that I could just pace, in front of a building, which I think I'm the only demographic, right, that could do this and not have someone call the police on you for pacing. And I had the pleasure of meeting the people who live inside, met the owner, they welcomed me, and we've become friends. I've learned a ton about the history of this time in New York when Gardner lived there. I also went to Sandusky. The picture on the left is the house where HHG boarded, where she had her affair in Sandusky, and it's barely changed from when she lived there. So I got to get a real sense of what it was like to live there. The house on the right is the first house she ever owned when she moved to Washington in 1910, and you can see the dining rooms are exactly the same. So that helped me know, like, this Sandusky house really made an impression on her, because when, many years later, when she's 60 and she finally buys her own house, she has the dining room modeled the exact same way. So I had many adventures, and I traced her story in a variety of ways to find out about this fascinating woman who was a fallen woman who reinvented herself and then managed to be the one to get the 19th Amendment through Congress. A remarkable story. So when Gardner has her affair in 1876, as I mentioned, the historical record on her goes dark. She doesn't appear again for many years. And then she pops up in New York City in 1884 as Helen Hamilton Gardner. She changes her name, which you could do in the 1880s because no one could Google you and find out the real story. So she just reinvents and reemerges. And this is a picture of her from that time period. And this picture always makes me chuckle in some ways, because I don't know if you all remember that that character, Edith Ann, the Lily Tomlin character, where it's like a little girl in the huge chair. So here is HHG, and even though she's 30 in this picture, she looks, 12 in this big chair, and she's thinking these big ideas, because when she reemerges, you can see that she's spent these 8 years kind of in exile, reading and thinking and trying to make sense of her predicament, trying to understand the sexual double standard and what had happened to her in Sandusky. And she determines that the root cause of the sexual double standard and woman's second-class status is the Bible. So she determines that she's going to be the one to speak the truth, to tell other women, oh, you think you're going to church and it's helping you be a good person, but really it's these biblical stories that are keeping you down. And the reason she's inspired to do this is because in the 1870s and 1880s, the most popular speaker on the free thought lecture circuit is this man named Robert Ingersoll. He was known as the Great Agnostic. And now, if you can believe it, he would attract crowds of 10,000 and more. And people would go hear him speak about the Bible and ask questions about what it meant to be religious. And Ingersoll, I think, really became popular in part as a reaction to the Civil War and the great grief that so many people felt afterwards. People began to question their deeply held beliefs, their religions, in the wake of so much tragedy and loss. And Ingersoll's catchphrase was not that you should wait to be happy in the afterlife, not hope that you will reunite with people in heaven. No, Ingersoll's catchphrase was, the time to be happy is now. The place to be happy is here. The way to be happy is to make others happy. And this message really resonated. So when young Alice Chenoweth was in this exile, she had the chance to hear Ingersoll speak. And she began to wonder, if Ingersoll can attract crowds of 10,000 and more and make a living out of critiquing the Bible, why can't I? So she sent Ingersoll a charming letter. You'll see this is one of her kind of telltale signature moves. She sends a charming letter. She sent a charming letter with some of her ideas, and Ingersoll said, oh, you must read these in public. So when she moves to New York City with her lover, P.S., that she's not married to, still Charles Smart, he says, oh, you must read these in public and I'll introduce you. So Gardner gave her first public lecture in January 1884. No one had ever heard of her. She'd only had this name for like a month. She'd published nothing. But Ingersoll, the most famous man in America, travels to New York City to introduce her, guaranteeing her crowds, press coverage that no first-time speaker could expect. She wows the crowd. She immediately becomes a sensation. And I just want to read you a few sentences from this first speech, again, so that you can get a sense of the kind of woman that she was. Her speech was called Men, Women, and Gods. And again, she delivered it in January 1884. The first words she spoke in public. It is thought strange and particularly shocking by some persons for a woman to question the absolute correctness of the Bible. She is supposed to be able to go through this world with her eyes shut and her mouth open wide enough to swallow Jonah and the Garden of Eden without making a wry face. It is usually recounted as one of her most beautiful traits of character that she has faith sufficient to float the ark without inspecting the animals. So it is thought strange that a woman should object to any of the teachings of the patriarchs. I claim, however, that if she honestly thinks there is anything wrong about them, she has a right to say so. I claim that I have a right to offer my objections to the Bible from the standpoint of a woman. And she went on to read various passages of the Bible that struck her as troubling, and to point out why she thought that women should abandon the Bible, turn to science, and live lives in their own autonomous, ways. From there, she becomes a sensation, one of the most popular free thought speakers and writers. She published her first book, titled Men, Women, and Gods, like her lecture. Ingersoll wrote the introduction, and it went on to be reprinted multiple times throughout the 19th century. She continues to travel, speak, write essays, publish throughout the 1880s, and expands to new topics beyond the free thought movement. Just to give one example of this, I'm guessing most of you all are familiar with the landmark 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, to which 40% of the American public traveled and visited. Well, Gardner gave more speeches at the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago than any other American woman. The New York Sun reported that next to Susan B. Anthony, of course, the best known woman in America, that Helen Hamilton Gardner created the profoundest sensation. Other women reported that anytime Gardner went to speak, there were standing room only in the rooms and people lined up outside in the hallways. She was really a sensation. She had made a name for herself as a woman who speaks the truth and does it in a charming and funny way. She spoke at the World's Fair about motherhood, about science. She gave her speech that she had first started writing to Hammond called Sex and Brain, critiquing the brain science of the day. And her most popular speech that she gave at the World's Fair was called Woman as an Annex, meaning sidebar. She said, our whole thought system, all of our laws, all of our institutions, our entire culture is made around the idea that man is the main thing and woman is an annex or subsidiary to him. And she said that has to change. That was her kind of through line in life. But by this time, various personal trials and tribulations that I won't get into here, but that I detail in my book, have really shown to her the limits of what you can say in speeches and what you can say in nonfiction. Gardner is still puzzling over the limits of marriage for women, why women still basically have to be married to support themselves, and about the sexual double standard. But you couldn't really go around giving speeches or writing nonfiction about sex. So Gardner turns to fiction so that she can say what she really wants to say. She starts writing short stories and novels. Her first novel is called Is This Your Son, My Lord? And the second, which follows in 1892, is called Pray You, Sir, Whose Daughter? And in these novels, she starts critiquing the sexual double standard and what she believes is the biggest problem of the era, which is the fact that men and young boys are taught from a young age that it's fine to sow your wild oats with no repercussions, whereas for women, the repercussions could not have been more serious, right? For a woman to lose her virginity before marriage, that's seen as like the fast track express train to prostitution, ruin, or death. For these bold writings, she becomes known as the Harriet Beecher Stowe of fallen women because she's using novels to raise public awareness about women's limited options and what the sexual double standard really means for women. This is also when Gardner begins to learn about politics. Now, from her free thought days, she's already best friends with Elizabeth Cady Stanton because they are free thinkers together. She works on Stanton's Women's Bible. But Gardner, like Stanton, thinks that suffrage is too small, too narrow of a reform. Gardner is too radical at this point to be hanging out with the suffragists. So throughout the 1880s, 1890s, she doesn't have anything to do with them. She's on her own path and she's a freelance kind of, which is what Elizabeth Cady Stanton refers to herself as. But Gardner begins to engage in politics around the issue of the age of consent. So now, I know I'm giving you all a lot to think about tonight, but I want you to put your listening ears on really good when I tell you this, and remember that in 1890, the age of sexual consent for girls, the age at which courts considered a young woman able to consent to sex with a grown man, the age of sexual consent in 1890 was 12 or younger in 38 states. It was mostly 10 and 12. In Delaware, it was 7. Now, a lot of women thought this was a big problem, but not a lot of women were bold enough to go around talking about it. Now, Gardner was. So she writes about this in her novel, especially that's the theme of her second novel, Pray You, Sir, Whose Daughter? And then she moves to Boston in 1895 to edit this reform periodical called The Arena. And she makes The Arena like a single issue magazine about raising the age of sexual consent. And she has great success. The other people who were interested in this movement were the women temperance activists, the women in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Now, Gardner has nothing really in common with these ladies. She's not Christian and she opposes temperance, but they're aligned on this issue, which is a signature issue for the WCTU because, as their president said many times, the Siamese twins of vice are strong drink and the degradation of women. So Gardner learns how to change laws, how to lobby, how to negotiate through her efforts to raise the age of sexual consent in many states. She tracks legislation in countless states through The Arena. She writes various state legislators, and this also shows women, including the women in the temperance movement, how important it is for women to have the vote. Now here I'm going to tell you a fun fact. In 1894, women were enfranchised in Colorado. As a result, 3 women the next year were elected to the Colorado state legislature, including this woman, Carrie Hawley. Now, can you guess what the first bill ever introduced by a woman state legislator in the United States was? The very first bill was introduced by Carrie Hawley, and it was to raise the age of sexual consent to 18. So this example really shows women and temperance activists the power of the vote for women. This is why women need the vote, to be able to control what happens to their bodies. So point number 1 of tonight is the through line between sexual autonomy and the vote. End scene on that. Then Gardner goes and has many other adventures, many other trials and tribulations. She begins a new chapter in 1902 when she marries this guy, Selden Allen Day, who's a Civil War hero. They travel the world for 5 years. This is a picture of the thousands of lantern slides she took. They're held by the National Anthropological Archives of the Smithsonian in DC. And she had many adventures, including this one where she's crossing the desert in Egypt on a camel. So we can talk more about those later, but just trust me when I say she had a good time. They come back to the States and they settle in Washington, DC, and they purchase a house, the first house that Gardner has ever owned in her whole life, at 1838 Lamont Street. Now, who do you think is her next door neighbor? The Speaker of the House of Representatives, James Beauchamp Clark. Now, Gardner has never really been involved in the suffrage movement, as I mentioned, until now. Now she's in DC, she's married to this revered Civil War hero who's whatever the 1910 equivalent of a Rolodex is, whose Rolodex is chock full with other Civil War heroes and their sons, which, by the way, is exactly who's in charge of everything in DC in the 1910s. So Gardner enters this new world of connections, of socializing, which she obviously did not have when she was like this radical free thought sex reformer in the 1890s. And she lives next door to the Speaker of the House of Representatives. So she joins what is the largest suffrage group, and it's called the National American Woman Suffrage Association, or NAWSA, NAWSA for short. And she quickly becomes what they call their most efficient volunteer in Washington. Her first big task is to plan the landmark 1913 suffrage parade. This is one I'm sure you all have heard of or seen pictures of, to protest, or not really protest, but to coincide with the inauguration of Woodrow Wilson. This is Gardner with Alice Paul, who at first she works closely with, and then they become lifelong enemies. They hate each other's guts. And this rivalry between Alice Paul and Nassau really colors the suffrage movement for the next 10 years. Now, when Trudy and I were on her radio show last week, Trudy said, Kimberly, did Helen Hamilton Gardner ever hang out with Alva Belmont, who you all know as Mrs. Vanderbilt? And I said, no, but we didn't have a chance to go into it. So I wanted to tell you all here because you might be interested. The reason that Gardner did not really encounter Alva Belmont is because Alva Belmont was totally on team Alice Paul. Here she is shaking hands with Alice Paul. Alva Belmont funded the National Women's Party. Their headquarters is the Sewall Belmont Mansion. So this is why Gardner did not interact with Alva Vanderbilt Belmont. It's because they were on opposite teams. So Gardner's first big to do is she secures all the permissions for this parade. Now you can see over 5,000 women marched, many more people attended. Gardner got all the permissions. That's her first big thing. Now, I know we're at about 40 minutes, so I'll just say a few more things and then we'll open for questions. The other thing I wanted to highlight was Gardner's diplomatic work as a suffragist. So once she's ensconced in DC, Nassau begins to call her not just their most efficient volunteer, but their diplomatic corps because of the ways that she communicates messages to her neighbor, the Speaker of the House, and also to President Woodrow Wilson. And I just want to give you an example of this. Gardner's first reached out, you can see her letterhead here. She first reached out to the White House In 1916, President Wilson had been in office for 3 years already, and she writes this letter to his chief of staff, a guy named Tumulty, and she says, I've just gotten back from California where she had spent the winter, and she'd heard that Alice Paul, her former friend, now enemy, has started heckling the president at all of his public appearances. Now, Gardner is horrified. Even though Gardner was a firebrand and a sex reformer and a free thinker, she was always well-mannered, super charming, very polite. And in fact, that's how she got to say the things that she did, is because she kind of couched them in her feminine charms. So she says, Tumulty, I cannot believe that this woman named Alice Paul has been heckling the president. Let me assure you that she does not speak for the real suffragists of America. And she encloses a memo detailing the differences between Gardner's team, Nassau, and Alice Paul's team, the National Woman's Party. Gardner says, you know, and she charms them and she says, here's my calling card, here's my list of references, and it's all senators and members of Congress. And then she says, P.S., does Mrs. Wilson ever accept callers? And then in pencil at the bottom of the letter, someone wrote, sure, 10:15 tomorrow. So the very next day, July 6th, Gardner is already inside the White House. Meanwhile, Alice Paul and her National Women's Party protesters are outside trying to get in. Over the next 18 months, from when Gardner first sent that letter to Tumulty, she becomes a welcome daily presence at the White House. She calls on the phone, she stops by, Wilson sends her letters, he sends her flowers from the White House gardens when she's sick, she sends apricots from her gardens. She cultivates such a close relationship with Wilson that she boasts that she had asked for 22 favors and he granted 21. Even Carrie Chapman Catt, who was the president of Nassau, never approached Wilson or went to the White House without first going through Helen Hamilton Gardner. This is a picture of Gardner and Carrie Chapman Catt leaving the White House. So Gardner's colleagues in Nassau credit her, as they called her, the most potent factor in getting the 19th Amendment through Congress and with converting the president to the cause. When Wilson enters the White House, he's very lukewarm. He supports suffrage on a state-by-state basis, but by the time Gardner gets through with them, he's cabling senators from Europe while he's negotiating the Treaty of Paris. He's calling up people on the phone every day. She even would send him bulleted to-do lists, if you could imagine sending the president a bulleted to-do list, and he would do them. So she really played a huge role in the trajectory of the 19th Amendment. So the final thing I just want to say about how the 19th Amendment got through Congress is that by the time Gardner gets there, the main objection has nothing to do with like women's brains or the destruction of the patriarchal family, which is what the 19th century objections were. The main objection has to do with Black women voting in the South. And you can really see that if you follow Gardner's correspondence with senators and congressmen and with the floor speeches. I have an op-ed in the Washington Post from last year that Trudy or Leslie or someone could post if you wanted like the short version of it. And I'll just give you one example from a letter that Gardner wrote to and what she received from her friend, Senator John Sharp Williams of Mississippi. He was obviously opposed to the 19th Amendment, but suffragists knew they needed to convert 2 more votes in the Senate. And they thought they might have a chance with John Sharp Williams because he was the most erudite man in the Senate, they called him, and because Gardner was really good friends with him. So she writes him many times, you know, asking him to vote. Yes, and he writes back candidly and says, and this is one of my other like most shocking archival finds, and it's from the Library of Congress, his collection there. And he says, as you can see in this letter, that he will never vote to enfranchise the Black women of Mississippi, that if he lived in any white state, he would vote to enfranchise women, but never in Mississippi. And then on the next page, the next quote says, the main reason that Black men in Mississippi don't go to the polls is not because all of the various state laws that disenfranchise them. It's because they know that if they do go to the polls, they'll get hurt. And he said, because women are women, whether they're white or Black, white men in Mississippi couldn't very well go beating up Black women. So that's why he says he can't vote to enfranchise. So you can really see the role of race the lengths to which white legislators would go in this and many other letters that I describe in my book to keep African Americans from the polls. That is the main objection to suffrage, was Black women voting in the South. Now, the takeaway message there is that the 19th Amendment gets through Congress not because anybody thinks it will enfranchise Black women, but because everyone knows it won't. The suffragists basically say, they capitulate to these fears and they say to the Southern leaders, we don't really care about the 15th Amendment. Just go ahead and disenfranchise the Black women just the same exact ways you have the Black men, through poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and just give us the 19th Amendment. So that's what happened. And here is Gardner at the signing ceremony for the 19th Amendment that she organized. She organized the signing ceremony, and I'm pretty sure it was the first signing ceremony. This is how smart she is. This is how clever. This is her savvy PR. She organizes a signing ceremony. She invites the press. This is the one with the Speaker of the House. This is the next one with the Vice President. There's Gardner with Maud Wood Park, the only women there. And Gardner even purchased the fancy gold pen used to sign the amendment because she's already thinking ahead, and she donates it to the Smithsonian for the exhibit that she herself organizes on the suffrage movement. So this brings us to the question of memory, where I will close. Whose names do we remember? Gardner, when she died, was the highest ranking woman in federal government. Wilson nominates her to the Civil Service Commission. She's in the papers across the country as the most prominent, the best example of what it means for women to be citizens. No one has ever heard of her. Here she is in a picture from 1902, where she's posing in front of Thomas Circle in DC. When she lives in DC, it's the era of commemoration. Everyone's building monuments, the Lincoln Memorial, various statues to Civil War heroes and generals. And I think here she's saying, why not me? Where's my statue? She's posing just like the man and the general, right? But there's no women. There's no women named. There's no things named for women, no streets, no monuments. And she's asking, whose stories will we remember? Whose stories will we tell about America and what it means to be American? And this, I think, is the central question of the suffrage centennial. So I thank you so much for your time and your participation. And I really am excited to hear some of your questions. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. I'm seeing a lot of people virtually clapping for you, so hopefully you can hear it all the way in Cincinnati.
Thanks.
That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so very much. Please all remember to submit your questions through the chat feature. You can send them to me directly, Leslie Jones. I did want to take a moment to acknowledge the beautiful book cover that's just behind Kimberly's shoulder. I'm going to show a picture of it here as well, if you can see it. This is Kimberly's book, Free Thinker. We do have this book for sale at our store, newportstyle.net, and also at our newly reopened Bowen's Wharf location in Newport. If you're in town, we welcome you to stop by and shop and buy this wonderful book. Further, I also want to say, if you're not in town, it's amazing. We have seen people chime in here from Arizona, from New York, from Massachusetts. So Kimberly, you're not the furthest person away joining us tonight. So thank you all so much. A few questions that are coming in. Let's see. Was Helen estranged from her family post-scandal? And who was Little Phil?
Yes. Oh, great questions. Okay. So was Helen estranged from her family? Yes. In part it's because everyone dies. So her three brothers fight in the Civil War. They don't die in battle, but they attain or retain various illnesses and injuries that cut their lives very short. And then when she becomes a free thinker, that further estranges her, and her one sister dies in childbirth, and the other sister she is estranged from. So I don't know the extent to which her family knew about her affair. I requested, her mom died in 1882, and I requested those probate records. And in those probate records, her children, her descendants are listed, and one of them is Mrs. Charles Smart. So she told her family that she had married the guy she had the affair with, although she never did. she doesn't really have any contact with them. And her favorite brother was Bernard. He was a free thinker, a Civil War hero, and then he was appointed U.S. consul to China, and he died in China in 1870 from his wartime injury. And then she's estranged from his family because she thinks his wife was like a social climber. And she wrote her first novel, Is This Your Son, My Lord, based on her nephew, who got into Harvard and basically drank his face off and squandered it away, while Gardner was trying unsuccessfully to get into Columbia. So the disconnect between what the rich brother squandered or nephew squandered and what she had attained. So the kind of the bad guy in her first novel is her nephew. And the second question is, who is Little Phil? Little Phil is her friend Mary Phillips. Now, Mary Phillips, I haven't been able to 100% figure out who Mary Phillips is. You know the photographer Jacob Riis? Yeah. Jacob Riis married, his second wife was a much younger woman named Mary Phillips. So for a while, I thought maybe that it was that, but I don't think it is. I corresponded with his biographer and compared handwriting, and I don't think it's that Mary Phillips. This Mary Phillips lived in New York City, had some money, basically she took in boarders, and they were boarders like Helen Hamilton Gardner and Adelaide Johnson, the sculptor of Suffrage. So she's like a boarder and also like a fixer for women in trouble. So when Gardner's lover dies in 1901, that's when she realizes that he had a wife the whole time, that the wife, she writes to New York and says, I'm the wife, I have the will, I'm coming to get all the stuff. And Gardner's like, oh my gosh. But instead of staying, she leaves town. She goes to Puerto Rico with the guy that becomes her husband and says, hey, Mary Phillips, can you just sort this out for me? So Mary Phillips hires a lawyer and sorts it out for her. So Mary Phillips runs the boarding house and is a fixer.
A very good friend to have.
A very good friend to have.
And thankfully she kept that letter too, because I'm sure there's so much of this narrative that we'd be missing if that one letter had been.
Well, there's so many. They're all in the Adelaide Johnson collection at the Library of Congress for reasons that I have no idea why. I guess because Adelaide Johnson also lived there. It's very circuitous.
Well, as a reminder to our audience, don't throw anything away.
Or do.
Well, maybe. Let's see. We have a lot of really great questions. Oh, and something very flattering. Are you working on a screenplay? This sounds like a great film. And looks like one of our audience members sees Jennifer Lawrence playing. And
I mean, that would be fabulous. That would be amazing. I would love for this to be sort of a movie, a documentary, or a movie. That would be a dream come true. So I am not personally writing the screenplay, but that would be for sure a dream come true.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
A good point also being brought up here, we are still fighting for voting rights even 100 years later for women and for women of color especially.
Yes.
What lessons can we learn today from HHG's fight of yesteryear?
That is the central question. And I hope that the suffrage centennial really shines a bright light on voter discrimination and the myriad ways it is ongoing today in every state. So, and especially the ways in which it is still race-based. So I think, in the final few chapters of my book, I spend a lot of time talking about the role of race and how the 19th Amendment got through Congress, which I talked a little bit about tonight, but I detail it in much greater ways. And I think that is the lesson, the great lengths to which white leaders and especially Congress have gone to keep Black people from the polls is really jarring, enlightening, motivational. I think if nothing else, I hope that this is a call for us to work for universal voting rights. People tend to think that this Constitution guarantees the right to vote. And a real study of the 19th Amendment shows that there's no such thing. There's no constitutional right to vote. There's various ways that you can't discriminate, but there's no just citizenship equals voting. And I also think that the 19th Amendment a study of the 19th Amendment shows how you cannot understand women's suffrage without understanding the 15th Amendment, which extended the right, at least on paper, to African American men after the Civil War. This 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, and the 19th Amendment was first written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, modeled word for word on the 15th. So the 19th and the 15th have a twinned history from the very inception until today.
That's very interesting. That's a very good point to make too. I don't think any of us are looking at the amendments in tandem with others. So that's for us all to think about too. Throughout her life, clearly fallen woman was a label that she had for many years.
Actually, she escaped it. She was a secret. She did not, no one knew that it pertained to her. She
Okay.
would be the champion of fallen woman because she pretended that her lover, Charles Smart, was her husband. So she had this veneer of respectability that kind of enabled her to talk about being a fallen woman because no one thought she herself was. But having had the experience herself really opened her eyes, I think, and enabled her to see this whole perspective on the women's limited options in marriage, sex, and heterosexual romance more broadly.
Absolutely. Of the 22 requests, what was the 22nd that President Wilson did not grant?
That's a great question. So the one he did not grant was in the fall of 1919, as Wilson is leaving for Europe to begin negotiating. Fall of 1918, when Wilson begins going to Europe to discuss the end of World War I and to negotiate the peace agreement. Gardner is always kind of one step ahead, and she says, well, you really need to have a woman on the peace negotiating commission. Why can't you appoint Carrie Chapman Catt, who already is a leader in both women's suffrage and in the international peace movement and is, respected by women throughout the world? Why can't you pick Carrie Chapman Catt for the International Peace Commission? And he said, oh, HHG, I love you and I'd do anything for you. And as much as I personally would like to appoint Carrie Chapman Catt to the Peace Commission, the other male leaders would not negotiate with a woman.
Interesting. Well, that's too bad.
Yeah. And she wrote back kind of a snippy letter too. It's the only really snippy letter she ever wrote. And she wrote him back and she said, your reply took courage out of my heart.
Oh my goodness. Well, 100 years later, I hope that she would have some sense of being proud of us. But that brings up another good point from one of our audience members. How do you think that she would feel about our pretty much low voter attendance today, considering all the strides that have been made in 100 years?
I think that would drive her crazy. I think she would be shocked and appalled at our low voter turnout because she took every responsibility so seriously, and she really wanted to establish, her life's mission was not so much the vote. I hope that I made that clear tonight. Her life's mission was for women to be autonomous in every way. She has this great quote where she said, her mission, and she thought that this was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, her best friend's mission too, for women to be recognized as self-directing, self-respecting human units with brains and bodies that are sacredly their own. So that's her goal. But as a part of that, she came to realize that women needed the vote. So I think she would be devastated to see not just low voter turnout among women, but among every demographic. I think she would be very shocked and appalled, especially because, her family sacrificed so much for the Union. That was a big part of her, the narrative she told about herself. And I think what enabled her or inspired her to be so brave herself was watching her father and her brothers sacrifice for the Union. So I think she would also be appalled to think of what later generations take for granted.
Right.
Her generation had lost and sacrificed so much for the Union and for the country.
And to think that she also lived through a pandemic herself.
Yes.
Flu.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness, there's so many good ones to choose from. I'm sorry, everyone, if I can't get to all of your questions since we are running a little bit out of time, but I want to ask one more. Let's see. How do you think her friend/frenemy, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, felt when HHG was appointed to a White House position?
Oh, her frenemy is Alice Paul.
Alice Paul, excuse me.
And actually, I know that for a fact. You can read about it yourself online. If you Google Alice Paul's oral history, which you can read and listen to, it's held at Stanford. So in Alice Paul's oral history conducted 50 years later, Alice Paul is super pissed. She is so mad. She brings it up like 4 times throughout the oral history of how in the world, first she's super pissed about the pen ceremony. She thinks, how does HHG get to the pen ceremony? And then how does HHG get to be the one that gets the appointment and not her? So she's really mad.
Well, I think it's because she organized the signing ceremony, which is also incredible. I love that you showed a lot of objects that survive from all of the conquests of her very, very extensive career. I didn't even realize that pen was hers at the Smithsonian, because I have seen it, but I didn't know that it came from her. Again, I too learned so much, as Trudy said, about this incredible historical figure. I cannot believe it has taken us this long to give her the due that she deserves. So thank you for writing this book. Again, buy the book. It's so, so wonderful. It's available at newportstyle.net if you'd like to buy it online and have it shipped to you, or please come visit us at our Bowen's Wharf store here in Newport. Kimberly, thank you so much. This was just a wonderful way to spend a Thursday evening. And thank you all so much for joining us. We hope to see you again next week. And please continue to support the Preservation Society, because we love having you as a part of our family. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.